Hi, my name is Kylie MacDonald, and I chose to do my project on social stories and social narratives. I'm going to begin by defining both a social story and a social narrative. A social narrative is a story that aims to increase social and academic skills in individuals through personalized stories. In my research, I did not find many social stories described as a social narrative, so I'm going to describe a social story next. A social story was developed by Carol Gray in 1993, and she defines it as a story that describes a skill, achievement, context, or concept based on the 10 defining criteria that ensure adequate learning opportunity for the child, adolescent, or adult with autism. Again, for it to be a Carol Gray social story, it must have those 10 defining criteria, which I'll go over later. ASHA, or the American Speech Language Hearing Association, defines a social story as structured intervention method with individualized stories constructed to explain certain social situations and the appropriate way to respond. Social stories include 3 different social cognition skills: theory of mind, weak central coherence, and schema. Theory of mind is defined as the ability to understand that one's own inner thoughts and feelings may differ from another person's, which allows the individual to understand the social story and how it may apply to different situations with different people. Weak central coherence could be present in an individual with autism, which weak central coherence is defined as in a situation, the individual would have a heavy focus on the details rather than the whole picture. This can be implemented with individuals or with social stories because social stories allow the individual to see the whole picture as well as the events leading up to that situation. And schema is defined as the understanding or representation of what things are and how to deal with them. An example of this would be like in eating, a spoon, a fork, and a knife may be involved. So the target population for social stories. Carol Gray originally developed social stories for individuals with autism. However, there's increasing efficacy to support the use of social stories for many other populations like learning disabilities, dyslexia, Fragile X syndrome, language impairment, hyperlexia, and young typically developing children. So as I noted earlier, there's 10 components to a social story. Anybody can be an author to a social story. So I think it's important to know the 10 different components, whether you're choosing to follow the Carol Gray method or choosing to follow your own method. So the first aspect of a social story is the social story goal. Then there's 2-step discovery, which is defined as when the author gathers research that's relevant to the audience, which is most likely a child, and identifies the most crucial information for the story. 3 parts in the title is the third aspect. Format makes it mine is the fourth, which is when the social story is individualized to the reader. 5 factors to define voice and vocabulary is the 5th component. 6 questions to guide story development is the WH questions of the story. So the who, what, when, where, and why. 7 is about sentences. A great formula is when it compares the total amount of descriptive sentences divided by the coaching sentences, which ultimately should be less than 2. 9 to refine, and 10 guides editing and implementation, which Carol Gray has 10 questions to ask about editing and implementation. So some potential topics of social stories. A social story or a social narrative can be written about a wide variety of topics. And some examples I found were aggression, screaming, greeting behaviors, sleeping in one's bed, and many other ones. Some features of a social story, they can either include all 4 of these or just some of them. Most of them do include some sort of writing and some sort of visual, which could be photographs, illustrations, picture communication symbols, or board maker symbols, which is an online platform. Also, some can be accompanied by videos or recordings. And more recently, social stories are becoming technologically advanced by using electronic or computer-assisted social stories. So here's just 3 examples of social stories that I found. None of these claim to follow the Carol Gray social story. But there's when I'm frustrated, using the toilet at school, and being a friend. So treatment of social stories. The treatment can be implemented inside the home, in therapy, or in school. But first you want to introduce the social story. But prior to that, you want to make sure the social story is addressing a single or multiple target behaviors. When introducing that social story, you want to choose a time when the individual appears more relaxed or in a non-threatening environment. The second treatment component is comprehension checks and revisions. The social story should be revised or modified when it seems appropriate. And comprehension checks are just verifying that the individual or the reader is understanding the information in the social story. There are studies that have been shown that comprehension checks throughout intervention yield better outcomes. And the third treatment component is generalization training, maintenance, and fading. And just two examples of this third component would be including peers in treatment, as well as extending times between each reading of the story. So maybe you have 2 days in between each reading of the story when before you only had a couple hours or a day. So there are 4 positives, probably more than 4 positives aspects of social stories, but here are the 4 that I chose to promote. So there's social stories reduce disruptive behavior in individuals with autism. Teachers have found that social stories are an effective way to reduce the disruptive behavior inside the classroom. There are a small amount of negative consequences using social stories. One consequence could be that the individual does not like to sit to read the social story. And so that's when the format makes it mine, or the 4th component of Carol Gray's method, is really important. So that's when you individualize the social story for the individual's attention span or abilities. And the 4th is it can be used alongside many other intervention approaches. And that's typically what happens with social stories. And my takeaway component is a bookmark. It defines social narratives, as well as I included 4 different links. Social Story for Kids had many free social stories. Autism Speaks has templates for social stories. I included the link for Carol Gray's social stories so you can learn how to write using her method. And then finally, the last website is And Next Comes Elle, which had many printable social stories. And finally, here are my references. Thank you so much for listening.